In this lecture, I would like to speak about the Abraham Accords. These are accords that Israel has signed recently with 4 other countries. We need to understand, however, the context in which these accords were signed and how these 5 countries, the 4 Arab countries in Israel, reached the point in which they decided to make this step, this public step. And you can see here President Trump at the White House lawn hosting the summit with the representative of Israel, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. So I'm going to provide a bit of a context about the Arab-Israeli conflict in which the Abrahamic Accords are taking place. This is the map of the Middle East, and you can discern quite quickly which are the main players here. So it's Egypt that had claims for many years to be the leader of the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and to a lesser extent Sudan, Iraq. Israel is hard to find. It's actually, it appears in the sea because there's no space for the name. It's such a small territory. If you're looking for it and you try to find it and you can't, well, it's somewhere between Jordan and Egypt. Let's take the point of departure, the 29th of November 1947. On this historic day or evening, to be exact, the United Nations had decided that Palestine will be divided into 2 countries. There will be an Arab state and there's going to be a Jewish state. The Jewish people were very happy to receive this partition plan. They were yearning, especially after the Holocaust, to have a Jewish home. However, the Arabs who resided in Palestine at the time rejected the partition plan with contempt. The following day, riots have started in which Arabs that were not happy with the decision attacked several villages and Jewish cities. And this is where the so-called War of Independence started. Started on the 30th of November 1947, and it lasted throughout 1948, so it was more than a year of fighting, in which the Jews were fighting to have some space on the globe that will be, its fate will be decided by Jews rather than by other people. So this was the first Arab-Israeli war. It's known as the 1948 war, and the Jews call it the Independence War. In the midst of the fighting, when the British folded the flag and returned home to Britain, because there was a British mandate at that time, until that time, in Palestine. The following day, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of Israel, declared the establishment of the Jewish state. This was on the 14th of May. And the following day, if the struggle with the Arabs is not enough, the following day, the less than 1 day state was attacked by 5 Arab countries. So there was fighting inside Palestine vis-a-vis the residents of Palestine, the Palestinians, or the Arabs as they were called at the time, and the Jews in that area, and the Jews also had to fend against the marching armies from the neighboring countries. Israel prevailed with the back and the wall. They won that war, and there were a few years of relative quiet. interruption because there were what we call fedayin, meaning intruders who came from the neighboring states, infiltrated the border, and blowing some things, trying to kidnap or to kill some Jews. But there was no war. There was terrorism, this kind of skirmishes attack. But then in 56, everything is erupted yet again, with the involvement of two other countries, France and England, who did not like Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, who decided to nationalize the Suez Canal against the expressed wishes of France and Britain. So they concocted some sort of a deal between them and Israel, and the Suez Campaign was carried out in 1956. Israel did prevail and occupied large territories from the Sinai Peninsula. However, under the pressure of the Soviet Union and the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, Israel had to retreat. And then the next eruption was in 1967, on the 6th of June. Another war. Nasser, unhappy with whatever happened in the previous years, 56, and since then, yet again, shut down, closed the straits, the Suez Straits, which was a casus belli, a cause for war as far as Israel was concerned. Israel launched a preemptive attack in early June, demolished the majority of the Egyptian Air Force, and the war ended very, very quickly within 6 days. And then another eruption came in 1973, in October 1973, on the holiest day of the year on the Jewish calendar. This is the Yom Kippur War. It was a hard-fought war, many casualties on both sides, but at the end of which Israel prevailed. There was a victory, and the Egyptian army had to retreat back to its side of the Suez. During the 70s, after the Yom Kippur War, we see strengthening relationship between Israel and the United States. And in 1976, the 39th president was elected. His name is Jimmy Carter. And Carter was, as a devout Christian, was devoted to the idea that Jews should live in peace. And he had this dream, this almost messianic aim to bring about peace. Carter said the United States has a warm and unique relationship of friendship with Israel that is morally right. So we're speaking about moral in politics. It is compatible with our deepest religious convictions, and it is right in terms of America's own strategic interests. We are committed to Israel's security, prosperity, and future as a land that has so much to offer the world. Against this background, in 1977, President Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, Nasser died in 1970, and then Sadat was elected. He declared that he is willing even to come to the Israeli parliament, to the Knesset, to bring about peace between the two countries. And as soon as he declared this in the Egyptian parliament, he received an invitation from Prime Minister Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, who invited him to speak at the Knesset. And Sadat flew to Jerusalem and met with Menachem Begin, spoke at the Knesset, and that was wins of history. Jimmy Carter, against this background, convened a summit in the fall of 1978, in which he invited the Israeli delegation and the Egyptian delegation headed by Prime Minister Begin and President Anwar Sadat to sit with Carter at Camp David and to sign a peace deal. This lasted about 13 days, where Carter did the majority of work of mediation between the two parties, and at the end of which Begin and Sadat reached a historic agreement. Israel would withdraw from the entire Sinai Peninsula, the United States will establish monitoring posts to ensure that neither side attacked each other. Israel and Egypt will recognize each other governments and sign a peace treaty, and Israel pledged to negotiate with the Palestinians for peace. This was an historic event indeed, because Egypt is a very large country. It had claims to be the leader of the Arab world. Nasser saw himself as the leader of not only of Egypt, but the entire Arab world. And because of its might, it has a very large army, and it was in the Israeli strategic defense, it was number one enemy. All the war games were conducted between Israel and Egypt. You take away Egypt from the equation, the other neighboring countries outside of Israel are unable to defeat Israel. So signing of this kind of agreement, taking out Egypt from the warfare, was a great bonus for Israel, a great achievement. Came, of course, with a considerable price, giving away the Sinai Peninsula, but it secured the border, and it secured, to a large extent, the destiny of Israel, its survival for a long run. And this is an historic picture in which you see the conclusion of the Camp David summit, as the leaders signed the peace agreement, and you see Menachem Begin, Jimmy Carter. On the left is Anwar Sadat. Let me quote from the State of the Union. That's the most important annual speech that the American president delivers each and every year. We are working with our allies to prevent conflict in the Middle East. The peace treaty between Egypt and Israel is a notable achievement which represents a strategic asset for America, and which also enhances prospects for regional and world peace. We are now engaged in further negotiations to provide full autonomy for the people of the West Bank and Gaza, to resolve the Palestinian issue in all its aspects, and to preserve the peace and security of Israel. Let no one doubt our commitment to the security of Israel. In 1982, yet another war, and this time it's between Israel and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that resided in Lebanon and made Lebanon its home. And from Lebanon, the PLO launched attack on Israel. And in June 1982, Menachem Begin felt enough is enough. That was following the assassination of Shlomo Argov, who was Israel's ambassador to London. And Israel launched an attack inside Lebanon. It was a very lengthy war, because this war started in 82. It finished only in 2000. So 18 years war. In December 1987, another milestone that I should record, and this is the official outbreak of the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against the occupation, the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza. The Intifada lasted until 1993, until the signing of the Oslo Accords in September 1993. At the same time, in 1993, President William Jefferson Clinton was elected and started to preside in the White House. And Clinton said, "Our relationship would never vary from its allegiance to the shared values, the shared religious heritage, the shared democratic politics, which have made the relation between the United States and Israel a special, even an occasion, a wonderful relationship." The Palestinians were headed by Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, following the Oslo Accords, came to some sort of an agreement, but this agreement never materialized into a full-fledged peace agreement. I don't have the time to elaborate on this. I'll be more than happy to take questions and to explain the reasons for that. But let me say the following. In 1983, there's this historical event of signing of the Oslo Accords, and this is, again, another very famous picture in which Bill Clinton, the President of the United States, is presiding over the first handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. The two leaders never met until that point, and this was a historic handshake. The two leaders agreed to shake each other's hand. Don't take anything for granted. This was very difficult. And then a year later, after the signing of the Oslo Accord, Israel signed peace accords with Jordan. So the peace with Jordan was the second peace agreement that was signed, and that still is holding water after Egypt. I said Oslo was a declaration of principles, mutual recognition between the PLO and Israel, but it never came about to a full-fledged position. So in 1994, we have the second neighboring country, Jordan, to sign a peace agreement of Israel. And we need to understand that these peace agreements between Egypt and Jordan are extremely important in order to understand the Abrahamic Accords that we've seen signing recently between Israel and 4 other Arab countries. In 2000, there was an attempt to resurrect Oslo and trying to mend the differences between the two parties, the Palestinians and Israel. And under the leadership of Bill Clinton, the two sides met. The leaders of Israel, Ehud Barak and his entourage, and Yasser Arafat and his entourage, they met in Camp David, the same place that Begin and Sadat met in the late 70s. However, the result was not the same. The Camp David summit ended in failure. The two sides were unable to bridge differences between them and were unable to agree on a peace deal. This was in July, and in September, the second Intifada, known also as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, erupted. This Intifada lasted for about 2 years until Israel erected the so-called fence or wall that separates the West Bank from Israel. 2006, yet another war, and this time Lebanon again, not against the PLO, but against the Hezbollah, that is a religious organization, Lebanese organization, sponsored by Iranian money, and very much using violence to fulfill its aims. In 2006, they killed and kidnapped few Israeli soldiers, and Israel decided to retaliate with a full-fledged war. For about a month, the entire north of Israel became to a halt because the Hezbollah was firing rockets on the north of Israel. Between 1 million and 1.5 million people in the north could not lead normal life because of the rockets that were falling each and every day. Each and every day, the Hezbollah fired about 140 rockets on Israel. The Israeli army, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, were inside Lebanon attacking Hezbollah targets and creating a lot of mayhem and destruction, and killing as many Hezbollah people they could. But Israel did not win the war. The war ended by a UN resolution after a month of fighting, in which there were not significant achievement on part of Israel. Israel certainly did not find a way to stop the rockets. It did not dismantle the Hezbollah of its arms, could not demand Hezbollah to leave Lebanon as it did with the PLO, and was subjected as to barrages of rockets. So it came to a standstill. There was no declared winner in this thing, and this war showed that difficulty of a country to subdue another organization. President Trump came to power in 2016, and you could see quite immediately that this is a different type of a president. One of his first statements about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when he was asked, he said, two-state solution, one-state solution, whatever the parties want, we will support. As if he was speaking about tea or coffee. I mean, two-state solution, one-state solution are so different from each other and entail so different consequences from each other. But he didn't mind that much. He just wanted some sort of a solution, and he showed very little understanding of what each option actually means. He sent mediators to speak with the Palestinians. There was not much need for mediation with the Israelis because he and Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, are constantly on the phone and on a very friendly relationship. So the mediation was trying to bring the Palestinians forward to negotiate peace with Israel on Israeli terms. It didn't go very well, and these attempts at mediation ended up by breaking relationship between the United States and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority had to close its embassy in Washington, and the relationship between the two sides came to a halt. The entire mediation or negotiations with the Palestinians was one-sided. It was clearly a pro-Israeli stand that the Americans took. When the discussion with the Palestinians ended in failure, this is when the Trump administration started to look elsewhere. And the entire strategy changed direction. So the focus became from the Palestinians to the Gulf states. So the aim no longer is to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to reach agreements between Israel and some other Arab countries. They try to find the similarities and the connections between Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, and moderate Arab states that are quite afraid and have, I would say, justified anxieties by the growing influence of Iran and the Iranian aspiration to bring more and more territories and countries under the wing of the Islamic Revolution. The commonalities between the moderate Arab states and Israel are security, prosperity, and development of these countries and the people moving forward. And the idea is to install cooperation and to replace confrontation, resolving conflicts through dialogue, mutual respect, and moderation. So the first agreement came in August 2020 when Israel and the United Arab Emirates have agreed to establish full diplomatic ties in a historic Washington broker deal. And the second Abraham agreement came in September 2020 when Israel signed another normalization or peace agreement with Bahrain. And this is when Bahrain became the fourth Arab country after Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE to agree to full diplomatic ties with Israel. Like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain was never fought a war against Israel. It doesn't share any border with Israel. But Bahrain, like most of other Arab countries, had long rejected diplomatic ties with Israel in the absence of a peace deal with the Palestine. And now, in September 2020, they decided to change course and to do this, to sign an agreement with Israel, notwithstanding the relationship between Israel and Palestine. I highly recommend to you to listen to Mr. Fahd Al-Binali's speech at the Middle East Study Group here at Hull. It is on the Canvas site. I posted the speech. It's not a long speech. It's about 20 minutes in which Mr. Al-Binali explains Bahrain interests and shared interests with Israel. In October 2020, a third Arab state is signing the Abraham Agreement, normalization treaty with Israel, and this is Sudan. And they decided to normalize their relationship. And then the fourth and last until now, and that was the last thing that Trump was able to do during his presidency, is to push forward to an agreement between Israel and Morocco in December 2020. Unlike the Gulf states and Sudan, Morocco ties with Israel go back to the 1950s and became formal following Israel interim peace accords with the Palestinians in the 1990s, following the Oslo Accords. Moroccan Jews have served as ministers and close advisors to the royal court in Morocco, and it was through covert contacts with Morocco in the 1970s that led to Israel's peace treaty with Egypt. However, in 2000, after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, Morocco ended all diplomatic ties with Israel and closed its mission in Tel Aviv. And as I said, in late 20, Morocco changed course and decided to join the other three Arab countries to sign normalization agreement with Israel. So what the Abraham Accords are all about? They're about economic and trade cooperation, information technology and postal services, collaboration between the two sides, Israel and each of the Arab country, cooperation in innovation and technology transfer. Israel is very good at that, and the Arab countries have money to invest. Banking and finance technology, renewable energy and green technology. The countries have vision of more than just bilateral agreements. They want peace and cooperation to the Middle East and to enable people to enjoy the opportunity and prosperity that decades of conflict have denied them. Supporting two-state solution between Israel and Palestine that would secure the rights of the Palestinian people. This is something that is not an agreement between Israel and the four other countries, the four Arab countries, but something that certainly the four Arab countries are pushing forward. All signatories believe that the Abraham Accords will bring the region close to a just, lasting two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So this is something that all five countries think that the Palestinian stand that these normalization agreements are opposed to the Palestinian interest. This is wrong. Actually, all the five countries believe that these are steps in the right direction, and these accords will help the Palestinian cause. And of course, as I mentioned, this is an alliance between Israel and countries that oppose and do not like to see Iran getting more stronger than it is. As more states engage in the process, this will itself create a strong momentum towards peace, and the move towards peace will prompt other states to join the Abraham Accords, and it will make diplomatically and politically more difficult for any participants to act in a way that might endanger the prospect of peace. Thank you very much.